It's
I saw you
cold,
talking to
and
the
it's
others.
just the two of
What
us
did
in
you
here.
say?
I told
We
them
have
we need
no
to find a way to
choice
live
but,
together peacefully.
said the trembling woman.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Snow pushed across the plains in uneven waves, hitting Mason Hale's face with a sharp sting as he guided his tired horse along the faint line of an old trade route that barely showed beneath the rising drifts. Mason leaned forward slightly in the saddle, using his body weight to steady the animal each time it slipped in the powder. His coat had stiffened from the cold, and the leather creaked each time he shifted, reminding him how far he had ridden without rest. The wind pressed against his ears hard enough to drown out nearly every sound except the crunch of hooves sinking deep into the frozen ground. He glanced toward the sky, heavy, dark, and lowering in a way that promised the storm would worsen within minutes. He knew these plains too well to mistake the signs. Nights like this were not survivable out in the open, so he steered toward the only shelter he remembered in this part of the territory, a small trading hut abandoned years ago after the routes shifted west. He had used it once in better weather while hauling supplies, back when he still worked with other men and believed that staying close to people meant staying safe. Those days were long behind him, and the memories tightened something in his chest, but the hut remained the only thing standing between him and a freezing night. His horse stumbled again, catching its weight just in time, and Mason slowed it with a firm grip on the reins. "Easy," he murmured, though his voice came out hoarse from the cold air he'd been breathing for hours. He rubbed the animal's neck through his glove, then nudged it forward with gentle insistence. They were close. He could see the faint shape of the building ahead, its roof sagging under years of neglect and its door half buried by the storm's earlier pass. When he finally reached the shelter, Mason dismounted slowly, testing the snow depth with his boots before committing his weight. The cold shot up his legs, but he kept steady, leading the horse beneath the low overhang. His hands shook slightly as he unfastened the reins. Fatigue and cold had settled deep into his muscles, but he pushed the discomfort aside. He always forced himself to stay functional in harsh conditions. It was one of the few skills that had kept him alive after the ambush that killed the men he once led. He stepped to the door and braced his shoulder against it. The swollen wood resisted, swollen from moisture and old age, and for a moment he wondered if the structure had finally given out. With one more hard shove, the latch snapped free and the door jerked open. Mason took one step inside and halted immediately. Someone was already there. A woman sat against the far wall, wrapped in a thin blanket too small to cover all of her. Snowflakes clung to her hair in melting patches, and her shoulders shook with uncontrolled shivering. Her eyes, half hidden behind loose strands of black hair, fixed on him instantly. Fear and exhaustion mixed in her expression, the kind that made her straighten instinctively, as if preparing to defend herself even though she had no strength left. Mason kept his hands visible, letting the door close firmly behind him to block the wind. The temperature inside was barely better than outside, but at least it held stillness instead of the biting push of the storm. He took in the details quickly: a cold fire pit, a scattered pile of feathers in one corner, a torn cloth bundle near her feet, and the faint smell of smoke lingering from a fire that had burned out hours earlier. The woman adjusted the blanket to keep it from slipping off her shoulders. Her fingers trembled as she did so, revealing dark marks around her wrists. Mason recognized restraint marks immediately, and the sight tightened his stomach. He had seen too many people bound against their will on the supply routes. Raiders, deserters, and frightened settlers all left their marks on others. He did not ask who had done it. He saw that she was cold, alone, and without any safe place to go. He moved slowly toward the fire pit, not taking his eyes off her until he reached it. She followed his movements carefully, her breathing tight, as though each decision he made determined whether she stayed safe or not. Mason lowered himself to one knee and drew out his flint. His fingers stung from the cold, but he worked with deliberate movements, arranging small pieces of dry grass and what he carried for situations like this. He always kept enough for a fire. Years of solitary travel had taught him that one small oversight could cost a man his life. A spark caught, then another, and finally a thin flame rose. He fed it carefully until the fire pushed enough warmth to light the room in uneven patches. Shadows slid across the walls, showing the depth of her exhaustion and the condition of her clothing. Deerskin layered with pieces of cloth she must have gathered on her way here. Her skin had taken on a chilled, reddish tone from hours in the cold. Up close, the bruises on her wrists looked worse, and she pulled the blanket higher, as if to hide them when she noticed him looking. She swallowed once before speaking. "My name is Nayeli." Her voice was quiet, unsteady, but not weak. There was strength beneath it, the kind that came from surviving more than she wanted to reveal. Mason nodded once, sitting on an old crate near the small, growing fire. "Mason Hale," he answered. He didn't offer more. He rarely did. Nayeli held his gaze a moment longer, perhaps assessing whether his presence meant danger or relief, then let her eyes drift to the fire. The shaking in her shoulders began to ease as the warmth spread. She loosened the blanket just enough to stretch her fingers toward the heat. Her hands looked scraped, stiff, and slightly swollen from the cold. Mason watched her carefully without making her feel trapped. Her posture, though exhausted, stayed alert, showing she had learned to protect herself even when barely conscious. He recognized the look, the constant readiness, the tension in the jaw, the way she scanned his movements. It was the look of someone who expected to be chased. He had seen it on his own face in the reflections of creek water after long nights running from the guilt he carried. She glanced at him again, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. "I didn't think anyone else would come here." "Storm's pushing hard," Mason said. "Most people stay put when it hits." "I had no place to stay," she answered quietly. The simple truth in her voice pulled his attention fully to her, not with judgment, but with concern he did not show openly. Mason had spent years keeping distance from people. Yet seeing someone in this condition, frozen, alone, frightened, pulled at a part of him he thought had shut down after the men he lost. And she was clearly in trouble. The fire crackled softly. Snow slammed against the roof in thick bursts. Mason adjusted the logs to strengthen the flames, then leaned back, letting the heat thaw the stiffness in his hands and shoulders. Nayeli kept watching him, but the fear in her eyes shifted slightly, replaced with something like cautious relief. Mason understood why. The storm had trapped them in the same space, and now their survival depended on how they handled the next hours. He had come here only for shelter and warmth, not expecting anyone else. She had come here because she had nowhere else to go. Neither of them said it, but both knew the same truth. The storm outside might kill anyone who tried to leave before morning. As the fire grew, the air inside the shelter changed from biting cold to a faint, breathable warmth. Nayeli's posture eased. Mason adjusted his coat, letting the warmth reach his numb chest. Both listened to the wind pressing against the walls, and in that quiet, a new understanding formed, thin, fragile, but real. They were strangers forced into the same refuge, each carrying their own past and pain, yet sharing the same fire, the same cold, and the same night. And neither would survive it alone. The storm strengthened after nightfall, turning the shelter into a rattling wooden box that shook with every heavy gust. Loose boards along the roofline scraped together as the wind forced snow into the seams, and the temperature inside dropped enough for Mason Hale to feel the cold biting through his layers again. He rose from the crate, joints stiff, and moved toward the far wall to check where the draft slipped through. His breath fogged in front of him with each exhale, showing how quickly the fire's heat was fading. Nayeli sat close to the flames, holding the blanket around her shoulders with both hands. Though the firelight brightened her face, exhaustion weighed on her features and her posture sagged from the long night she had already endured. Her eyes followed Mason's every step, alert even as her energy failed. The bruises around her wrists darkened under the shifting light, and she kept her elbows tight to her body as if to shield herself. Mason tore strips from an old saddlecloth he carried and pressed them into the cracks. The fabric jammed in place with some effort, blocking part of the draft. Cold air still pushed in from the corner, but the shelter improved enough to hold the heat a little longer. He worked slowly, not wanting to startle her, but also not wanting to leave the roof unsecured. When he finished, he returned to the fire and knelt beside it, stretching his fingers toward the warmth. The pain that shot through his knuckles told him how long he had gone without letting them thaw. He flexed them repeatedly, forcing circulation back into his hands while he studied Naeli's expression out of the corner of his eye. She had stopped shaking as violently, but her lips were still pale and the muscles in her jaw trembled each time she swallowed. She kept watching him, not with suspicion now, but with the unsettled awareness of someone who knew her survival depended on the man sitting a few feet away. The fire popped, sending a small spark toward the dirt floor. Mason adjusted the logs and lowered himself onto the crate again, but this time he positioned himself closer than before. The warmth reached him quicker at that distance. He noticed Naeli shifting her legs under the blanket to ease the stiffness, then pulling the cloth tightly around her again when the wind hit the wall with a sudden crack. He reached for the coat lying beside him. After a moment of hesitation, he held it toward her. "Your blanket's too thin," he said, voice low and steady. Naeli's gaze moved from the coat to his face, searching for intent. When she saw none beyond practicality, she reached out slowly and took it. Her fingers brushed his for an instant, cold, small tremors still running through them, before she pulled the coat around her shoulders. Heat spread across her upper body almost immediately, and she exhaled with a quiet, relieved sound she tried to suppress. Mason looked away to give her a moment of comfort without embarrassment. Snow slammed against the outer wall again, stronger than before, and a faint groan carried through the boards. The storm was not letting up. Mason assessed the shifting conditions carefully. If the roof weakened further, they would have to move away from the far corner. He kept his thought to himself for now. Panic would only drain what little strength Naeli had left. Another draft cut across the room. Naeli instinctively leaned toward the fire, but paused when she realized the heat wasn't enough. She glanced at Mason, unsure whether she was allowed to say anything, then pulled the blanket and his coat tighter. "It's getting colder in here," she murmured, voice rough from the long hours outside. "It'll keep dropping," Mason replied. "Wind's pushing in from the north wall. Fire can't hold the whole room." She looked around the small shelter, taking in the limited space, the thin walls, the snow building outside that trapped them. The fire warmed only the immediate circle in front of it. Anything beyond that remained chilled. "Where should we sit then?" she asked quietly. Mason paused. The question told him she had accepted that the storm gave them no choice but to stay together. His mind moved through the options quickly. Distance meant losing heat, and losing heat meant risking her collapsing before morning. He nodded toward the fire. "Closer." Naeli tightened her hold on the coat and shifted, inching nearer to the space where Mason sat. He adjusted himself without hurry, allowing room for her to settle beside him. When she stopped, their shoulders were separated by a narrow gap, just enough for each to maintain comfort, yet share the fire's warmth more effectively. The firelight created a steady glow along her face, revealing how exhaustion had etched itself around her eyes. Mason noticed the small tremors still running through her arms, the stiff way she held herself to hide discomfort, and the slight catch in her breathing each time a gust struck the shelter. When another cold draft pushed across the floor, Naeli flinched. Mason felt the air shift before it reached her and instinctively extended his coat to cover part of her lap. She looked at him in surprise, then nodded once, accepting the gesture without a word. Trust did not appear suddenly, but the beginnings of it took shape in the silence between their movements. "You traveled far today?" Mason asked, not out of casual interest, but to assess her physical state. "Too far," she whispered. "I kept walking because stopping meant the cold would take me." He absorbed the truth of that without judgment. He had made similar choices in the past, pushing through pain and exhaustion because nothing behind him was safer than the ground ahead. The fire burned brighter after he added another piece of wood, and the warmth filled the immediate circle more fully. Naeli uncurled her fingers slowly as they thawed. Mason studied the bruises on her wrists again, but did not mention them. He saw how she pulled the coat higher whenever her past came close to the surface. Outside, the storm screamed against the shelter, making the board shudder. Inside, the two of them sat near the fire, sharing what heat they could in the small space that held them. For the first time since they met, Nayeli let her shoulder rest slightly closer to his, not touching, but no longer retreating either. Mason did not move away. The storm made the decision for both of them, but the choice to sit near each other, steady, calm, and without fear, belonged to them alone. And in that quiet moment, Mason understood that the night would pass differently than he expected, not because of the storm outside, but because of the woman sharing his firelight. By the time the fire burned into a steady orange bed of coals, the storm outside shifted from violent gusts to a thick, relentless pressure that packed snow against the walls. The shelter darkened as the doorway filled halfway with wind-pushed drifts, leaving only the trembling firelight to cut through the dim interior. Mason Hale rose from the crate again, stretching out his back while he took in the state of the room. Cold air still slipped through two corners despite the cloth he had stuffed earlier. He knew the temperature would keep dropping until dawn. Nayeli watched him stand, her eyes following every motion like she needed to track each shift in his body to predict whether the situation would stay safe. She had stopped shaking, though her breathing still carried a faint unevenness. She sat with her knees pulled close beneath the blanket and Mason's coat, the firelight warming her skin enough for her face to lose the gray tint she had earlier. He moved toward the far side of the shelter where the boards had warped under years of weather. Pressing his palm against the surface, he listened to the noise outside. Snow piled higher, blocking the lower half of the door. They would not be going anywhere until daylight. He returned to the fire and crouched beside it, adding two more pieces of wood with slow, controlled movements. Nayeli shifted her weight and set her hand near the heat. She stared at her fingers for a long moment, then quietly adjusted the coat so her wrists were hidden again. Mason noticed the quick movement. She realized he had seen and exhaled through her nose, frustration and embarrassment mixing in her expression. "You saw the marks," she said finally, her voice low and flat. Mason nodded once, not pressing her for more. She pulled the blanket tighter and stared into the flames. The firelight reflected in her eyes, making the exhaustion there even clearer. When she finally spoke again, her tone was steady, but her fingers curled into the fabric with tension that betrayed what it cost her to speak. "They tried to take me back," she said, "not because I did anything wrong, because I refused to ignore something they wanted ignored." Mason waited. He had learned long ago that silence, when offered with steadiness, could keep a person from shutting down. "There was a child," she continued, "a boy too young to stand on his own. He was punished for something he didn't understand. I stepped in. I held the man's arm so he would stop." Her jaw tightened. They didn't like that. She rubbed her wrists unconsciously, forgetting she was trying to hide them. Mason saw the bruises clearly now. Wraps had cut into her skin. She had likely fought against whoever held her. "They said I crossed a line I had no right to cross," she said. "They said I interfered where I didn't belong." Her voice held no self-pity, only a quiet anger she attempted to keep contained. Mason watched her carefully. He could see she hadn't slept in too long, hadn't eaten enough to keep her strength steady, and had walked farther than any person should in the cold. "What happened after?" he asked gently. "They tied my hands," she answered. "Said they were bringing me back to be disciplined. I broke free when one of them loosened his grip. I ran until I lost the sun behind me. They didn't follow. Maybe they thought the cold would finish what they wanted to start." Mason listened without moving. Every detail she gave him felt like a piece of a larger picture. A woman forced from her own people not because of wrongdoing, but because she defended someone weaker than herself. The storm pressing against the shelter walls felt strangely distant as she spoke. "I didn't know where I was going," she added. "I only knew I could not go back." She lowered her gaze to her hands again. The knuckles were scraped, likely from falling repeatedly in the snow. Mason took in the small tremor that still ran through her fingers. Her strength was there, but barely held together. He shifted a little closer, careful not to close the distance too quickly. "You did what you believed was right," he said, his tone even and grounded. "That didn't matter to them," she replied, lifting her eyes to meet his. It matters to me, he said. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Her eyes held his with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet. Not fear, not caution, but something like relief trying to break through her exhaustion. She looked away before it could show fully, pulling the blanket up again. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence that settled between them. Mason reached into his pack and pulled out another blanket, thicker than the one she had. He held it toward her. Use this too, he said. She hesitated, not because she distrusted him, but because she wasn't used to someone offering something without cost. When she finally took it, her hands brushed his again, warmer now, steadier, and she draped the blanket across her legs. Thank you, she whispered, barely audible. Mason nodded and sat back against the crate. The storm outside pressed against the shelter with slow, heavy pulses, but inside the room the tension had shifted into something calmer. Not comfortable, not yet, but grounded. Nayeli pulled the thick blanket over her knees and stared at the flames. She no longer held herself in that rigid posture of someone expecting danger at every moment. Mason noticed the change, not large but real. Their lives had collided because of cold and necessity, but the connection forming now came from truth spoken without shame, received without judgment. Mason leaned his head back slightly, letting the warmth reach his stiff shoulders. Nayeli rested her hands on the new blanket, breathing more evenly than before. For the first time since the storm began, both of them sat in the shelter without bracing for the next threat. And for the first time since she ran, Nayeli's voice did not carry fear when she spoke. The storm settled into a heavy, steady pressure by the time the night reached its deepest point. Wind no longer screamed across the plains. Instead, it pressed snow against the shelter with slow, powerful weight that made the old boards creak in different tones. Mason Hale rose from his place near the fire, feeling the stiffness in his legs from sitting too long in the cold. His boots thudded softly against the dirt floor as he moved toward the weak corner where the wall had started to bow inward. Nayeli lifted her head when he stood. She adjusted the blanket on her shoulders and watched him inspect the cracked seams along the roofline. Her breathing had steadied, and her eyes carried more focus now that warmth had returned to her limbs. She noticed everything he did, but didn't speak, allowing him space to assess the structure without interruption. Mason pressed his palm against the loose board and felt a faint draft sneaking around its edge. If this gives way, he said quietly, the snow will come straight through. Nayeli's fingers tightened around the blanket as she studied the weak point. Can you fix it? I can brace it, he said, already scanning the room for usable materials. He crossed to the far wall, where broken crates had been stacked long ago. Kneeling beside them, he tested each plank, checking for rot. Most were brittle, ready to splinter if touched too firmly, but one piece still held enough strength to support pressure. He pulled it free, brushed the dust from its surface, and carried it back to the damaged section of the wall. Nayeli shifted closer to the fire, giving him room to work while keeping her hands warm. The flames reflected in her dark eyes as she tracked his movements with calm, careful attention. She admired the way he moved, quietly, methodically, assessing each problem before touching it. There was no panic in him, only a steady sense of responsibility that made her chest tighten with something new. Mason angled the plank beneath the weak board and applied slow pressure until the wood settled into place. The creaking stopped. He then wedged a flat stone from near the doorway under the end of the plank, securing it so the brace wouldn't slip if the wind shifted. The shelter quieted slightly as the wall straightened and held firm. Nayeli watched him step back and eye the roof again. He wasn't satisfied yet. He pulled the saddle blanket from his gear, folded it twice, and pressed it into the corner where the cold pushed hardest. The thick fabric absorbed the draft, sealing the gap. When he turned toward her, she felt a small breath of warmer air brush across her cheek. You fix things the way someone does who's had to rely on himself too long, she said softly. He paused, not expecting her to speak so directly. No one else is out here to do it, he answered with a small shrug. That doesn't make it easy, she said. He didn't reply, But the faint shift in his eyes showed her words landed somewhere deeper than she intended. Snow slid down the outer wall with a low rush, and both of them listened until the sound passed. The shelter remained steady. Mason lowered himself to the floor beside the fire, stretching his legs across the dirt. Nayeli shifted closer, not touching, but no longer keeping a deliberate distance either, so that the increasing heat reached her more fully. She looked at his hands as he warmed them over the flames. His knuckles bore scars from old fights, trail work, and labor he never explained. There was strength there, but also restraint, every motion controlled, every decision weighed before acted on. "How long have you traveled alone?" she asked. "Long enough to forget what it was like not to," he answered, his voice quiet but unwavering. She nodded slowly. She knew something about living without anyone to trust. Her own solitude had come abruptly, harshly forced on her in a moment when she had acted out of instinct, not rebellion. Mason looked toward the repaired wall, as if reviewing his work. "This will hold until morning," he said. "Storm should ease by then." Nayeli lowered her chin, absorbing that information. Morning meant decisions. Morning meant facing whatever came after leaving the shelter. A flash of uncertainty crossed her face, quickly tucked away, but Mason noticed. He didn't call attention to it. He simply added another piece of wood to the fire, increasing the warmth between them. The flames rose higher, casting a steady glow across the small space. Shadows moved gently across their features, revealing unspoken fatigue, quiet pain, and the beginnings of familiarity neither of them expected when the night began. Nayeli exhaled slowly, the air warming against her lips. "If you hadn't come," she said, "I don't think I would have lasted much longer." Mason looked at her, his expression unreadable but softened by something that wasn't pity. "Storm would have taken anyone out there alone," he said. "You reaching this place at all, that took strength." Her eyes lowered, not in shame, but in acknowledgement. No one had told her that before. Not since she fled, not since she stood up for a child who wasn't hers, not since she refused to bow to someone who misused their authority. Those decisions carried weight, and hearing someone recognize her endurance loosened something tight inside her. Mason leaned back against the crate and let out a quiet breath. "We'll make it through the night," he said. For the first time since she entered the shelter, she believed it fully. A small, steady warmth settled between them. Not from the fire alone, but from the fragile trust forming through simple actions, shared silence, and the knowledge that survival had become a joint effort rather than a solitary fight. Nothing had been planned, nothing had been asked for, but everything had begun to change. The fire had burned long enough to spread a soft, steady warmth across the center of the shelter, leaving the corners dim and cold. Mason Hale reached for his pack and pulled it closer, the leather stiff from frost and long use. He opened it slowly, sorting through his supplies with deliberate movements that showed how carefully he rationed everything he carried. He removed a small tin of dried meat, a cloth-wrapped bundle of hard biscuits, and a narrow flask of water he had been saving for emergencies. Nayeli watched him prepare the food with sharpened attention, though she kept her hands folded beneath the blanket. Her hunger showed in the way her eyes followed each item he set on the ground, but she didn't reach for anything. She waited, studying his intentions with the same caution she had shown since he arrived. Mason tore one piece of meat into smaller sections, placing half near her and keeping half for himself. He didn't push it toward her or insist she eat. He simply set it within her reach and returned to arranging the fire so the coals cooked the dryness out of the biscuits. Nayeli reached out slowly, testing the air to make sure no misunderstanding would follow, and took the meat with a quiet nod. The first bite made her eyes close briefly. The relief in her expression was honest and unguarded. Her stomach must have been empty for longer than she admitted. Mason noticed the sharpness in the way she chewed, controlled but desperate, and he understood immediately that she had gone without for days. He handed her one of the warmed biscuits. "Careful," he said, "it's still hot." She accepted it with both hands. The heat against her palms made her shoulders relax for the first time since he found her. She chewed slowly at first, as though reminding her body how to eat properly, then took another bite with slightly more confidence. Mason ate his portion in silence, pacing each bite so nothing felt rushed or careless. He wasn't used to sharing meals. The last time he had eaten beside someone was years ago, around a supply trail fire, before the ambush that left him alone. That memory pressed briefly at the back of his mind, but he shoved it away with practiced discipline. Tonight required his attention here, not in the past. Naeli finished her biscuit and wiped her fingers against the inside of the blanket. She stared at the fire for a long moment before she said anything at all. "You didn't have to give me this much." Mason shrugged lightly. "Wouldn't do me any good to watch someone starve in front of me." Her eyes lifted to his, studying him with new depth. She searched for insincerity, for something hidden beneath his tone, but found nothing except quiet practicality. That surprised her more than generosity would have. He reached for the flask and uncapped it. "Take a drink," he said, handing it over. Her fingers brushed his briefly as she took it, the touch warmer than earlier. She hesitated before lifting it to her lips. Water hit her throat with a small gasp she didn't mean to make, and she forced herself to drink slowly. Each swallow steadied her pulse. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and handed the flask back with a quiet, "Thank you." Mason recapped it and set it aside, understanding she needed more water, but also knowing their supply had to last until he found a source outside. When the weather allowed, he could melt snow for refills. Until then, they had to preserve what little they had. Naeli looked at the tin of dried meat, as if unsure whether she should say more. Her brows pulled together slightly before she spoke again. "I left quickly," she said, "too quickly to take anything with me. I thought I could reach the foothills before dark, but I was wrong. The cold caught me first." Mason listened without interrupting. Her voice carried no dramatics, only the plain recounting of someone who had been forced to make decisions under pressure. "I didn't think I would make it to this shelter." She paused, running her thumb over the blanket. "I kept walking because stopping felt like giving in to whatever waited for me out there." Mason nodded once, recognizing the mindset she described. He had been in that same place before, pushing forward not because he believed he would survive, but because stopping meant surrendering to something he wasn't ready to face. "People don't always chase with ropes," she said softly. "Sometimes the cold chases just as hard." Her words hung between them, not poetic, just painfully accurate. Mason leaned forward and added another piece of wood to the fire. The flames climbed, revealing the shadows under her eyes and the strain tight around her mouth. She had endured far more than she allowed herself to show. "You walked a long way for someone already hurt," Mason said. "Most wouldn't have made it." "I didn't think about distance," she replied. "Only direction." She drew the blanket closer around her chest. "I wanted to reach a place where no one knew my name." Mason studied her, recognizing something familiar in that statement. He had left his own name behind once. Not the letters, but the weight tied to them. He understood that desire to disappear from the world that judged too quickly. "You're safe here," he said. It wasn't meant as a promise, only a statement of present truth. Naeli glanced at the repaired wall, at the fire burning brighter, at his steady posture beside her. She didn't smile, but her shoulders lowered a fraction in relief. "I believe you," she said quietly. The storm pressed against the shelter with another long, heavy sweep. Mason shifted slightly to block the draft that snuck around them. Naeli pulled the blanket higher, and her knee brushed his leg. Not deliberate, not hesitant, just a small, unconscious move toward warmth. He didn't shift away. Her breathing evened, and she rested her hands near the fire once more. The small meal had restored enough strength for her to sit upright without trembling. Mason watched the flames, listening to the shelter settle, listening to her breathe, listening to the wind lose some of its force outside. For the first time since the night began, they were no longer surviving separately. They were enduring the storm together, sharing food, sharing fire, sharing silence. And that small shift changed the entire room. By the time the fire settled into a deeper orange glow, the shelter had taken on a new stillness. The wind outside no longer came in sudden bursts, but moved in a constant, heavy sweep that pressed snow against the walls in slow, grinding waves. The sound was steady enough to lull the mind, but the cold it carried seeped into every crack, reminding them the night had not eased its grip. Mason Hale stood again, slowly, because his legs had grown stiff, and walked to the repaired section of the wall. He ran his hand along the brace he had set earlier, checking for any shift in pressure. The board held firm, but a faint draft reached his fingertips. He nodded once, acknowledging it but not panicking. The structure would last until morning if they stayed close to the fire. Nayeli sat where she had been since the meal, wrapped in the thick blanket Mason had given her, with his coat layered over her shoulders. Her breathing was calm enough now that she no longer had to steady herself before speaking. Her eyes followed Mason without the tension she carried earlier, though a guarded layer still remained beneath her expression. He returned to the fire and added another log, pressing it into place until the flames rose in a brighter arc. The added heat spread quickly, warming the center of the shelter. Nayeli stretched her fingers toward the flames, then glanced at Mason's coat around her shoulders. "You should keep this," she said softly. "You need it more," Mason replied, lowering himself onto the floor near her. "The cold gets you too," she insisted. "I've dealt with worse," he said, meeting her gaze with a steady look that ended the argument. She didn't push further. She understood the tone of someone who made decisions based on survival rather than comfort. The fire popped sharply, sending a shower of sparks upward. Nayeli flinched, then let out a slow breath as she settled again. Mason noticed the small reaction and shifted closer, not touching her, but enough that the shared heat filled the gap between them. "You're still on edge," Mason said quietly. "I'm used to being alert," she answered, "even when I'm too tired to stand." "It'll ease," he said. "The storm can't get in now." She studied his face for a moment. The firelight revealed the lines around his eyes, the faint scar along his cheek, the calm set of his jaw. There was no threat in his posture, only focus, discipline, and exhaustion that he refused to admit aloud. "Why were you out here tonight?" she asked carefully. Mason hesitated, not because he didn't want to answer, but because the truth required more words than he usually used. He looked toward the roof, listening to the weight of snow shifting above them. Then he said, "I was heading south, one a distance from the last town I stayed near. Too many people asking questions I didn't want to answer." Nayeli lowered her blanket slightly. "Curious. What kind of questions?" "About a supply route I used to ride," he said, "and about the men I worked with." His eyes stayed fixed on the flames. "I didn't want to talk about any of it." She didn't ask for details. She recognized pain when someone didn't name it. Instead, she said, "The people who chased me didn't want me speaking either." He looked at her then, not surprised but understanding. "People don't like being challenged, especially when they know they're wrong," she said, her voice firmer than before. Mason nodded once, acknowledging the truth in her words. He shifted slightly closer as the cold seeped through the floorboards. Nayeli didn't move away. The distance between them narrowed into something that felt intentional rather than forced by the cold. Another gust collided with the shelter, shaking loose snow from the roof. The floor vibrated faintly. Nayeli glanced toward the sound, but Mason remained completely still. His calm steadiness grounded her more than the fire did. "You don't seem afraid," she said. "I am," he replied. "I just don't show it unless I have to." His honesty caught her off guard. She looked at him with a softer expression than she had shown all night. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "but not of you." Mason didn't answer immediately. He watched the flames, considering her words. Then he said quietly, "You should get closer to the fire." Cold's settling deeper. She nodded and scooted closer until her shoulder brushed his arm through the blanket. The contact was brief, but natural, not forced. Mason adjusted his position so the heat from both their bodies mixed with the fire's warmth. Nayeli pulled the blanket around both of them without thinking, and when she realized what she had done, she tensed slightly. Mason didn't move away. He simply allowed the shared warmth to settle. "You can rest," he said. "I'll stay awake a while." "You need rest too," she murmured. "I'll take my turn," he answered. She studied his profile again, the straightness of his posture, The way he kept one hand near the fire while the other rested loosely on his knee, the control in every breath he took. She trusted that he meant what he said, not because he promised it, but because every action since he entered the shelter had proved his intention to keep her safe. Nayeli shifted the blanket, so more warmth passed between them. Her head dipped slightly toward his shoulder, not touching, but leaning close enough to show she felt steadier now than she had since the night began. The storm pressed on the walls again. The wood creaked. The snow built higher. Inside, two people who had started the night as strangers now shared the same fire, the same silence, and the same growing understanding that neither had expected. The room held them in a fragile pocket of warmth while the winter outside continued its assault, and for the first time since they entered the shelter, the night no longer felt like something to endure alone. It felt like something they would survive together. A faint blue tint settled over the shelter long before the sun cleared the horizon. Mason Hale opened his eyes to the sound of the wind, shifting from fierce gusts to a low, steady push that no longer rattled the walls. The storm had weakened, but the cold clung to the air with a sharp stillness. He took a slow breath, feeling the ache of a night spent half awake, monitoring every noise that might signal the roof giving way. Nayeli still sat beside him, wrapped in both blankets and his coat, her head bowed slightly as though she had drifted into light sleep sometime before dawn. Loose strands of her hair brushed her cheek, and her breathing came in calm, steady pulls that revealed how much her body had finally relaxed. Mason watched her a moment, making sure she wasn't shivering. She looked worn down, but not in danger. He rose carefully, not wanting to startle her. The floor was cold enough that his boots made faint cracking sounds as he stepped across small patches of frost that had formed during the night. Moving to the door, he pressed his shoulder against it. The heavy drift outside resisted, but the storm's pressure had eased enough for the wood to shift a few inches. Snow spilled inward, but light pushed through, illuminating the room in pale color. Nayeli stirred at the change in brightness. She lifted her head slowly, blinking as she adjusted to the cold air near the doorway. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke. "Is the storm finished?" "For now," Mason said, pushing the door again. "Snow's blocking most of the way, but it's not falling as hard." She moved the blankets aside and stood, steadying herself with the wall until her legs remembered how to hold her weight. Mason watched her carefully. She didn't sway, but her posture betrayed how much strength she had spent the day before. She walked to his side and looked at the snow-packed entrance. The drift reached nearly to her waist. "How long to dig it out?" she asked. "Not long," he replied. "The top layer's loose. Once we break through, the rest will fall away." She nodded and looked out at the pale sky beyond the drift. The snow glowed faintly under the early light, and a thin frost sparkled along the edges of the shelter's roof. The landscape looked untouched and silent, as though the storm had pressed the entire world into stillness. Mason stepped outside first, using his arms to push away clumps of snow. The air stung his face, but it was a clean, clear cold, not the lethal kind that had chased Nayeli through the plains. She followed him out slowly, careful not to slip as her feet met the uneven ground. Once outside, she paused and breathed deeply. The cold struck her lungs, but it also brought a clarity she hadn't felt since leaving her band. She wrapped Mason's coat tighter around her shoulders and looked across the endless white stretching toward the distant foothills. It felt different now, less threatening, as if the storm had scrubbed the land clean. Mason brushed the last snow away from the doorway and looped his reins over a half-buried post near the shelter. His horse shook violently, sending frost flying from its mane. He patted the animal's neck, checking for stiffness or injury. The horse nudged him with a low grunt, tired but unharmed. Nayeli stepped forward and studied the horizon. "I thought I would die before morning," she said quietly. "You made it," Mason replied, tightening the saddle straps. "You didn't quit." She looked at him then, taking in the steadiness of his presence, the way he moved with quiet purpose, and the tired set of his shoulders that suggested he had carried more than his share of long nights. Mason wasn't smiling, but there was a noticeable shift in his expression, an unspoken acknowledgement of the night they had survived together. Nayeli returned it with a faint nod, the closest she could come to saying she trusted him without using the word. She took a step toward the trailhead, but stopped when she realized he wasn't moving yet. "Where will you go now?" she asked. "South," he answered. "Small settlement 2 days from here. Quiet place." She tightened her hold on the coat. The wind pushed lightly against her hair, carrying the last remnants of the storm away. "You don't have to travel alone," she said, carefully choosing each word. Mason paused. He studied her face, reading the strength she had regained, the fear that lingered beneath it, and the determination that kept her from being swallowed by it. He realized, then, that she wasn't asking for protection. She was asking for the chance to move forward with someone who didn't expect anything from her except truth. "If that's what you want," he said. She stepped closer until the frost-crusted ground barely separated them. "It is." He nodded once, simple, direct, and final. "Then we go together." Nayeli's breath softened at that, like a weight lifted from her back. She walked toward the trail, waiting for him to join her. The morning light grew stronger, sharpening the edges of the plains but softening the fear she carried. Mason took the reins, adjusted his hat against the wind, and stepped to her side. Nayeli kept her pace even, matching his stride naturally without needing instruction. They didn't speak again for several minutes. They didn't need to. The night had shown them who they were without words. The morning showed them they were not walking alone anymore. The sun climbed slowly over the white horizon, spreading a thin band of gold across the plains as Mason Hale and Nayeli prepared to leave the shelter behind. The world looked washed clean after the storm, silent, open, and marked only by the trail the wind had carved through the drifts. Their breaths drifted in steady clouds as they packed what little they had, each movement revealing the weight of the night they had survived. Mason tightened the cinch on his horse, checking it twice out of habit. The animal shifted, stamping once before settling. Its muscles pulsed beneath the saddle blanket, showing it was cold but strong enough to move. Mason ran a gloved hand along its neck, feeling the tension ease under his touch. Nayeli folded the extra blanket with precise, slow motions. She had regained enough warmth for her fingers to move without trembling, though the stiffness in her shoulders betrayed how much effort she was still using just to stay upright. Mason's coat hung around her frame, heavy but comforting. It covered the torn edges of her dress and shielded her bruised wrists from the open air. The shelter behind them now looked smaller, half-buried, and fragile in the bright morning light. Mason took one last look at the patched wall, noting how it held through the night. It had done its job. Nothing more could be expected from a place built years ago and abandoned by everyone except desperate travelers. "You ready?" he asked, adjusting the reins again. Nayeli met his eyes. There was no hesitation in her voice when she said, "I'm ready to leave this place." She stepped forward, her boots sinking lightly into the packed snow. The wind that brushed across her face felt different from the night before. Cold, yes, but not threatening. It carried a quietness that almost resembled peace. Mason walked beside her until they reached the narrow path leading toward the open plains. The snow shifted under their steps, making a soft crunch that broke the morning silence at regular intervals. After a few minutes of walking, Nayeli slowed her pace slightly. She looked ahead, then back at Mason. "What kind of settlement is it?" she asked. "Small," he said. "Hardworking folks. Not much trouble if you keep to yourself." "Do they ask questions?" she pressed. "Only if you give them reason," he answered. She absorbed this thoughtfully. Her eyes drifted toward the distant foothills, where the sun caught the frozen ridges and made them shine in uneven streaks. She took a breath, steady and deep, before speaking again. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like. I have nothing with me. No guarantees. No place waiting." Mason walked beside her in silence, letting her speak at her own pace. "But I don't want to walk the rest of the way alone," she said. "Not after last night." Her voice carried no softness, only truth. Mason understood the meaning beneath her words. She was not asking for protection. She was asking for a chance to build something new, even if she didn't yet know what that something was. He slowed his stride until they walked evenly. I wasn't planning on traveling with anyone, he admitted, but I'm not leaving you behind. A flicker of relief passed through her features, so subtle that someone unfamiliar with her would have missed it. She lifted her chin slightly, as if acknowledging a change she could finally accept. The trail narrowed where the land dipped between two low rises. Mason guided his horse to the side so they could pass through without sinking into the loose snow. Naeli stepped carefully, watching each placement of her foot. Her balance steadied with every step. As they climbed the next slope, she glanced at him again. "Why did you help me?" she asked, not accusing, just wanting clarity. Mason considered the question. He didn't rush his answer. "You were freezing. You were alone. No one deserves to die in the cold like that." He exhaled a slow breath. "And leaving you would have felt wrong." She accepted this explanation with a quiet nod, though her expression softened further. Something about his blunt honesty settled the last of her unease from the night before. They walked a few more yards before she said, "I thought you'd ride on without me in the morning." "I thought about it," he replied truthfully, but the idea didn't sit well. She looked forward again, absorbing how much that meant without embellishing it. The plains opened wider as they topped the ridge. In the distance, faint shapes marked where the land dipped toward a frozen creek bed. The sky had cleared into a pale blue with streaks of thin clouds drifting toward the mountains. Naeli paused at the ridge. Mason stopped beside her. The cold air wrapped around them, but neither moved right away. She turned toward him with an expression that held no fear now, only determination and a cautious kind of hope. "If you'll walk with me," she said, "then I'll walk with you." He didn't smile, but the shift in his posture felt like one. Then that settled. They started down the ridge together. Naeli walked close enough that her shoulder brushed his coat now and then, not by accident, but by quiet intention. Mason didn't pull away. The contact felt natural, steady, and grounding. Behind them, the shelter vanished into the snowdrifts. Ahead of them, the plains stretched wide and unfamiliar. But they no longer faced it as two separate people. They faced it as a pair who had made a choice to continue forward, side by side, into whatever waited next. The sun rose higher as Mason Hale and Naeli continued south, leaving a winding line of footprints behind them. The plains stretched wide in every direction, bright under the new layer of snow that glistened in the early light. Each step forward felt different from the night before, steadier, lighter, and guided by a shared purpose neither of them had spoken fully aloud. The storm had forced them together, but the morning made their choice voluntary. They traveled in silence for a long time. Mason led the horse by the reins while Naeli walked beside him, her pace matching his without effort. The cold no longer bit through her bones, and the strength in her steps returned gradually with movement. Mason kept one eye on the horizon and one on her posture, making sure she wasn't pushing herself too hard. Around midday, they reached the frozen creek bed Mason had mentioned. The water beneath the ice made a hollow, distant sound, and the sun reflected sharply off the frozen surface. Mason paused, letting the horse drink from a shallow break in the ice he created with his boot heel. Naeli crouched near the bank, cupping melted snow in her hands to wet her lips. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes were steady, alert, alive, and no longer clouded by fear. Mason watched her for a moment longer than he intended. She caught his gaze and stood, brushing her hands on the coat he had loaned her. "What's on your mind?" she asked. "That you're holding up better than most would after a night like that," he replied. She stepped closer, her expression calm. "I had a reason," she said. "Someone believed I shouldn't be left to freeze." He didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when he felt something he didn't know how to name. "Wasn't right. What happened to you?" he said finally. "No," she answered, "but I survived it." There was no bitterness in her tone, only certainty. Mason respected that more than he expected. They followed the creek's edge for another hour until the land opened into a wide valley. In the distance, a line of smoke curled from the chimneys of a small settlement. A cluster of buildings set low in the snow, barely visible against the pale backdrop. "There," Mason said, stopping at the ridge. "That's where I plan to go." Naeli looked at the cluster of structures. She took in the shape of the smoke, the placement of the barns, the movement of small figures tending animals. Her shoulders tensed slightly. "They won't know me," she said. "They don't need your past," Mason replied. "Just your presence." She turned toward him slowly. "And you? Will you leave after we arrive?" "No," he said, without hesitation. "Not if you want me there." Something shifted inside her at those words, something steady, not fragile. They descended the slope together. As they walked, the wind softened into a faint breeze, carrying the distant smell of burning wood. The closer they came to the settlement, the clearer the details became. Fenced corrals, stacked firewood, laundry frozen stiff on a line, smoke curling in lazy ribbons from chimneys. Naeli slowed, sensing the finality of what stepping into this new place meant. Her life, before the storm, had ended the moment she fled. What came next depended on her willingness to accept a future she had never imagined. Mason stopped beside her. His voice was low, certain. "We don't have to go in today. We can circle around, rest in the trees, take time to breathe." She shook her head. "No, I've run enough. I don't want to hide anymore." Mason studied the firmness of her posture, the resolve in her eyes. She wasn't the same woman he had found freezing in the shelter. She stood taller now, despite the bruises on her wrists, despite the exhaustion lingering beneath her skin. He offered his hand, not out of formality, but because the moment called for something simple and clear. Naeli looked at it for a heartbeat, then placed her fingers in his. Her grip was warm and steady. They walked the remaining distance side by side. As they entered the settlement, a few townsfolk paused to look their way. Not with suspicion, just mild curiosity. Mason nodded to the first man who passed, and the man nodded back in casual greeting before moving on. Naeli exhaled quietly, realizing these people were not here to judge her. This place was a new beginning, untouched by her past. Mason guided her toward a small cabin near the creek. "It's vacant," he said. "Belonged to a trapper who moved east last year. Folks let travelers use it until someone claims it." Naeli stepped to the doorway and looked inside. The cabin was simple: bare floorboards, a small stove, a narrow cot, and a table that leaned slightly to one side. It wasn't much, but it was hers if she chose it. Mason stood behind her, waiting for her reaction. She turned to him, studying his face with quiet certainty. "Will you stay nearby?" "I'll stay with you," he answered. Naeli stepped fully inside and placed her hand on the edge of the cot. The moment she touched it, something inside her settled. Safety, possibility, stability she hadn't felt for months. Mason entered after her, removing his hat and setting it on the table. The room warmed with their presence, faint sunlight cutting across the floor. Naeli reached for his coat and held it out to him. "I'm warm enough now," she said. He accepted it but didn't put it on. Instead, he laid it across the cot and met her gaze. "You don't have to face anything alone anymore." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "I know." Their hands found each other again, this time without hesitation, without fear, without the cold forcing them near. This time was choice. Outside, the wind softened into a quiet drift that brushed against the cabin walls. Inside, Mason and Naeli stood together in the first place that felt like a beginning. There were no threats waiting, no storm pressing in, no danger hunting either of them. Just warmth, clarity, and the promise of shared life built from the moment they stepped out of the shelter together. Their story didn't end with survival. It ended with belonging, and the start of their future, side by side, without a single doubt left between them.